Peace. This is episode 58 of No Truths Barred, the best up and coming podcast on the internet. And I'm your host, Hoy Kwaku Timmons. And listen, today is a really special episode. I can't express enough the powerful guest that I have on today. This is a brother that I've known for many years. I've seen some of his activism, his poetry, even his rapping abilities firsthand, and many, many more other endeavors that he's involved in. And the brother I have on today is brother Iman Shabazz. And so I'll go ahead and give you guys his bio, just kind of give you a synopsis of his background. And then I'll let him go ahead and add a little bit more on as well. This is the official biographical sketch of brother Iman Shabazz. So before anything, Iman Shabazz is a son, an elder, brother, uncle, cousin, friend, and baba to many Watoto of the family and communities to which he belongs. Among many hats, he is the policy advisor for community engagement and reform initiatives in the Office of the Commonwealth's Attorney for the City of Richmond. He also offers consulting services as the founder and CEO of Maximum Impact LLC. Iman bears several certifications to train and facilitate a host of interventions, public health strategies, and other programs to include emotional emancipation healing circles, the Alternatives to Violence Project, mental health first aid for adults, and creative conflict resolution. Iman has been a community activist and organizer since his early high school years and has given exceptional service to various community-based organizations working to alleviate the suffering of oppressed persons globally. From appearing on CNN's American Morning to local news media to his own live call-in television show, Fighting for Freedom, Iman has been an incessant voice of education, awareness, and organization in the face of racial and social injustices. He is often sought after for his delivering keynote addresses, seminars, and workshops on such topics as dismantling systems of oppression, African history, undoing racism and sexism, as well as community responses to national and international issues. Iman stays active as he's found a deep-rooted love for mountain climbing, skydiving. Oh, that's really dope. I want to try that one day. Swimming, biking, and martial arts. He welcomes anyone who wishes to step up to the challenge of a friendly yet highly competitive game of Scrabble. Okay, whether he's seen as a Pan-African thought leader, restorative justice practitioner, activist, actor, MC, dancer, or poet, he seeks to use his talent and experience as a tool for liberation and healing. It is Iman's desire to build a free and just world for all humanity. Powerful intro. And I'll definitely like, if there's anything else you'd like to add on just about yourself, brother, because, you're definitely one of the key powerful figures in this city, and definitely add on.
Well, brother, I appreciate and I'm very humbled by your introduction. If I'd have known you were going to read all of that, I would have sent you 4 sentences. I think that, in terms of things to add, I really don't want to add much of anything. I think that hopefully through our dialogue, it'll give folks enough information to be able to know who I am if they're not familiar with who I am or my work already. I'd like to say the only things that I think that are of primary importance to me in terms of what you've read from the bio are those first couple of sentences. My relationship to family and community is primary for me. It's everything that's of importance. All of the other accolades or anything else that I've achieved are happenstance, if in my opinion, and secondary, because I could easily be doing something counterproductive and reactionary as opposed to the things that I've been fortunate enough to be able to accomplish. So when I introduce myself, I think that it's important for others to understand that it's our connections to family, it's our connections to the community, and it's our connections to the people that are of most importance. And if we're not utilizing our knowledge, skills, and information to be able to enhance the conditions of our people in that regard, then all the rest of it means nothing. That's just the way that I
Indeed.
feel.
I agree with that. It's how do we use all of these resources to the edification of ourselves, our community, and I definitely concur. But what I want to ask you is that one of the things in your bio, and just me knowing you, is that you're extremely astute and knowledgeable with African history, whether it's here in North America or other parts of the diaspora or on the continent of Africa as well. And what I want to ask you is, what was that initial catalyst that caused you to want to go and study our history and our circumstances? And then my follow up to that particular question is, was it your study of African history that also led to your path into activism as well?
Okay. So I'm going to come at answering that from two angles, if possible, and if that's allowed. The the catalyst, if you will, or the impetus for me studying about our people, and if you don't mind, I'm going to expand the context of studying African history to just a
Please
study of
do.
our
Yeah.
people in general, because that I think is what's important when we try to find resolution to some of the issues that we face. We really have to understand the ways of our people, certainly in addressing the context as what is actually of our peoples in the present context. So my initial or my impetus, if you will, for going along a path to that really kind of starts in our DNA. It starts in the resistance of African people that resides in us, whether dormant or active. It feeds our soul, it feeds our spirits, it feeds our behavior, our movement, our decisions. And so, what made me open or receptive to the idea that I needed to learn more about my people was that DNA factor, if you will, or that, what resides in the raging ancestors, if you will, in our chromosomes. But to put it in a much more, practical context, when I was in high school, we had an organization, if you want to call it that, that called African Males, where there were two elder men, not that they were elders at the time, but they were our elders,
Yeah.
as young people and students, who really kind of spearheaded this notion that it was important for us to learn about who we were, and what contributions we made as African people to society that would expand our, if you will, our imaginations around what we could contribute to the world and what we could contribute to our people. And I went to a high school that was supposedly for academic and creative excellence, if you will. And one of the phenomena that was occurring was that, from my freshman year, my high school was pretty small. And so from my freshman year, what we found that of the students who were part of this, again, this institution that was designed for academic excellence, the largest percentage of students that were failing were us, young African boys. And so they understood the necessity to not only go back to tradition and assemble us, if you will, as a group of young men, but then to really start planting seeds for our growth and development along the lines, again, of really becoming clearer about our identity and our contributions to the world. I would say that that was the impetus. There were individuals in particular who really, I guess, for all other purposes, where things just kind of clicked for me, where it made sense that not only did I need to understand our history and understand what that meant in terms of its current impact, but that I really understood that because we made such massive contributions to humanity and civilization, that it was important to go back and really understand, well, what were the things that made those periods in history successful? What were the things that could translate or be transferred in terms of knowledge and information from those time periods that we like to glorify, so to speak, so much, and how could we use that information to turn our circumstances around in a present context? And so, to your latter point or your latter question, yes, I mean, we used to say back in the day, I don't know what the young people say that's equivalent to it now, but once I got knowledge of self, it was easy for me to see the path, if you will, that I needed to walk from that point. And so for me, it just became clear that everything for me had to be seen from an African-centered worldview.
Mhm.
Everything had to be rearranged, if you will, or deconstructed from what I was taught to that point, in order for me to really be able to understand what it meant to liberate our people and what it meant to really be able to change the the horrible conditions, if you will, under which our people find ourselves in the current
Indeed. You kind of froze a little bit there.
Mhm.
Hold on.
Okay.
Okay, all right, we're back. We're back. And
Oh, gotcha.
the reason why I asked that question is because I like to know everybody's journey, into what people would label as consciousness or being aware or culturally
Mhm.
aware.
Mhm.
Because for myself, just briefly, my introduction was through my 10th grade history teacher. I was in detention,
Okay.
uh, being a hard head, like I shouldn't have, doing things I didn't need to do. And he introduced me to the book, They
Yeah.
Came Before Columbus, and I was like
Okay.
15.
Okay.
And that book totally it shifted my paradigm and my point of reference for a lot of stuff. Because a lot of times I went to
Mhm.
George Webb. So if you go into these inner city schools, you're not really seeing yourself at the table of mathematics and architecture and science and medicine.
Oh,
And I would say the impetus for me to really start to study our people was through my 10th grade history teacher. And it really changed my life. And I look at studying our history as not just knowing or hoarding or accumulating information, but it's really life changing. And it
mhm.
leads people to become activists. It leads people to change their lives. It leads people to pursue certain careers. And it's something Dr. Clark talked about. A lot of his students not only went on to
Exactly.
pursue history or be professors, but they also went on to become doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs. So we see the manifestation in African consciousness on so many different levels.
Mm, yeah.
To my next point, I want to ask you about a brother that you've mentioned a lot every time I've talked to you in the past, a powerful scholar by the name of Dr. Amos Wilson. And Dr. Amos
Right.
Wilson, the only book that I've really got into by him, but he has several, is Black Power, Blueprint for Black Power. And one of the things that
Oh,
Dr.
yeah.
Amos Wilson always inculcates is the concept of an African identity. And when he speaks about the African identity,
Right.
it almost seems that it's endemic to our solidarity and our health and our preponderance as a community. So what I want to ask to you, because you've mentioned this brother a lot, and his writings. When you look at Dr. Amos Wilson and his writings, the teachings of Africa having and cultivating an African identity, how is that
Mhm.
applicable to us as Black people in 2021? And how could cultivating an African identity in this particular epoch that we're in abet in our healing process as a people?
Wow. Okay. You said it. So, brother, if again, if you'll allow me to uh, go back and fetch, if you will, some
Yes, sir.
things
Yes, sir.
from what you said a few seconds, where you concluded, excuse me, with the first question, in order to come back to where you are now with the question you've raised. I think that it all is, it all ties together, and is important. Uh, One of the things that Nana John Henrik Clark left us with, of the millions of
Right.
axioms, excuse me, and uh, uh, the knowledge and information, if you will, that he left with us in and of itself. He often always stated that all history is a current event. That
Mm,
to no extent to which anything happened, whether it was 5 minutes ago, 5,000 years ago, it all impacts what's happening to us in a current context. And so when we understand that, it becomes really important to see that, as you already alluded to, history isn't really just about going back and reading dates and events, or even understanding relationships to the degree that you can in those time periods. It's really about taking that information and then transferring the knowledge, really eliciting, or what education should be, drawing out of ourselves what's important for us in the current moment. And so, in order to be able to resolve the issues of oppression, in order to be able to resolve the issues that we face in and of itself as African people, it becomes clear that in order to understand that history, we have to be clear about our identities. And it's very interesting because we're in a time where you can get confused about what that means. Often, when I was growing up, well, I'm still growing up, but when I was, let's just say, in my teens, as a younger young man, we were struggling, with, for example, just the utilization of the word African as opposed to Black or any other term that is often used in identifying our people. And what became very clear to me is that there's simply no point in history that we ever ceased being an African people. It all changed based on the aftermath, if you will, of colonialism and the colonial project, whether we're talking about the captivity of our ancestors who were brought to this land and spread throughout to 122 different countries across the world, or if we're talking about um, the resurgence, if you will, of positive assertion of certain terms within our various movements and our various struggles throughout the world. Ultimately, it becomes really important to be clear about where those identities lie. And so I feel like not early enough, but nonetheless at an early age, it became clear to me, excuse me, that I was an African man, or a developing into an African man, and that has remained, if you will, my identity, to this point. As we used to say, no hyphens, no hairstyles, no, other contradictions. We're just African people, period.
Yep.
And we can debate about that when it comes time, when we have re-empowered ourselves in order to be able to answer those questions about, then what do we do with the land, with the resources, what do we
Yep.
produce, how do we, develop, if you will, the totality of our functioning as a society. We can then debate about those things, but for me, there's no question about it. And so understanding the African identity means more to me than just going back and understanding tradition. That's the primary part of it. But as you alluded to with Dr. Amos Wilson, he also used to talk about the reality that we can't stay stuck in the 13th century. Those things that we loved about ourselves as African people,
Mhm.
that there definitely is a context for the present. I want to be really clear. The traditions, the rituals, the things that we engaged in worked for our people, and we need to understand how those things worked. The emphasis on family and the emphasis on how that family impacted the community or the society around us is extraordinarily important for us to understand in terms of turning our circumstances around in a present context. But we need to be clear that there's also a responsibility of development in terms of understanding what that identity is. And so, people have a there are some people who may still possess stereotypes of what it means if someone calls themselves African. I happen to have locks. It may not look like it right now because my hair is braided and pulled back, but I happen to have locks and have had them since I was a teenager. However, it doesn't require that. We are African people by the very fact that, as I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, that in our DNA we possess the elements that our ancestors transferred to us in the spiritual context, in the physical, if you will, context, in terms
Mhm.
of the transference, excuse me, of the material in those chromosomes, and what fuels our development and personalities and thinking in the moment. And so for me to go into our community, into any of our communities, excuse me, today, and emphasize the importance of an African identity really just means getting people to take the opportunity to really look at themselves and look within themselves and be clear about our purpose, and develop, excuse me, be clear about developing a purpose, and be clear about developing a sense of unanimity in terms of our interests. Not that we got to think the same way about everything, or that everyone has to look and talk the same way, so to speak, or use the same language. But the reality is if we realize that we're being oppressed to a point where we don't have enough food, then we need to come together and be clear about the strategy for which we're going to obtain the food, whether it's, it doesn't matter, whatever strategy that we align ourselves with. And it's in alignment with that sense of identity that becomes important in the African context. So that's for lack of a better term, my 38,000-foot view.
Yeah, and one of a very poignant and astute point that you made is just to view our history as a continuum. I think a lot of times when you study history, you look at things as being episodic. So it was like this period to this period represents Songhai, this period to this period represents Sokoto, or this period to this period represents the Reconstruction. But a more a more accurate way to look at it is we're in a continuum where we're impacted by the past and we're continuing to form the future off of our actions today. I want to, I guess, to expand upon that particular point. One of the things is I've read quite a bit of work, like from people like Rupert Lewis, my other brother Tony Martin, about Garvey, and sometimes you have this conversation with people about is repatriation still a thing that's practical, now? What does it look like to reconnect with Africa, whether it be like in a business sense, whether it be, just kind of like from an ideological perspective, from a cultural perspective. And one of the things I always argue is that we never lost that connection. We may not be able to recognize it, but we still are Africans, as you pointed out. So my question to you is, in 2021, and this is kind of more on a global level, when people talk about like, hey, how do we reestablish those connections with Africa, like currently on the ground, and you have certain people that I know that have gone to Ghana and that have started businesses, go over there to teach, or different other countries in Africa as well. How important is it for us as Africans out in the diaspora to try to build those relationships and connect with people on the continent now, as it relates to our own liberation here in the Western Hemisphere, in your opinion?
Well, so, and I appreciate the fact that you started this conversation off with at least raising Nana Garvey, because his perspective becomes really clear when it comes to the reality of connecting the then and the now. For me, I think that one of the things that's of primary importance for us to understand in terms of this connection is that in order to become re-empowered as a people, we have to really start answering questions about who owns and controls as people call it, the means of production, who owns and controls the way things are produced, the resources that are used to produce the things that we use in our daily lives, and how that those things, are distributed. When we're answering those questions, then we have to take a look at the reality that Africa has remained the richest continent on the planet. And unfortunately, there's almost nowhere on the continent of Africa that the resources are not exploited. There's been an effort, people use the term capitalism, which I do as well, but just to try to make things a bit more understandable, there's a global economic system that takes over and exploits people, their labor, and certainly the mineral resources of the continent to such an extent that for those of us, particularly who live in this country, a lot of it is out of sight, out of mind. We don't even think about the level of exploitation that happens. We don't think about the lives that are lost in order to produce the comforts and the material things that we're so accustomed to, and that for some of us, we would even argue that we can't live without at a present context. But trust me when I tell you, there's absolutely nothing that exists in terms of without African innovation. Let me just say that. And again, a material contribution, from our cell phones to the planes that fly in the air to our understanding of navigation of the ecology between water systems and even our navigation, if you will, in the aero con in this in the aero space context. We have to be clear that when people are still allowed to take control of the land, particularly, just using that in a broad context, then this continued exploitation of resources is not going to only continue to contribute to the impoverishment of African people on the continent, it will in turn play itself out in the existing impoverishment and disempowerment of African people throughout the world. As we used to say, anyone who come into and take control of your home, they can mistreat and disrespect you wherever they find you. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in, as African people here. There is an unquestionable connection that we have to realign ourselves with in terms of our connections to the continent. And in answering the question of repatriation, I think that there's a global conversation, there's a global dialogue, if you will, that has to happen in relationship to that. It is not as it's all of it is complex, unfortunately, because the dynamics of our oppression are complex. And so it isn't as simply answered as, well, I'm just going to go and take over some space. That removed history and the time frame from which we have been taken from various parts of the continent, most of us that we don't even know where those parts are, requires us to respect the development, even though it is also marred by colonialism and its own uh, ways of oppression of the former colonialists, if you will, colonizers. I'll say that, who took their assumed power. We still have to go in with a measure of respect and understanding that we have to redevelop these relationships. It's really no different than the basic reality of, if I grew up, which I did, in the East End, and I decide to come over to the South Side, I need to be clear about how things are, how things run in the South Side. Like what are some of the
Yeah.
differences and what are the nuances about the South Side that I need to be aware of in order to be able to not offend or re-offend, or to certainly not put myself in harm's way. And those are the kinds of things we'll have to struggle with. But from my vantage point, repatriation is a primary answer. I won't say it's the only answer, but it's absolutely a primary answer that we need to consider as African people, and be clear that it's a struggle just like our daily struggle living here in this country at the present time.
Yeah, and to that particular point, when you look at, in my opinion, when you look at the Congo alone, I think it's valued where it's like $24 trillion worth of mineral wealth in the Congo alone. So we're not even talking about the other countries on the continent of Africa. And also another part of that conversation is not only like the colonialism that we think about started under, Otto von Bismarck, advent of the Berlin Conference, but the neo-colonialism that's happening right now. I got into a conversation with a Wolof brother from Senegal, and he actually was trying to argue that the to an extent the Chinese were like a help send, if you will, I guess, to juxtapose Western powers and their influence in Africa. But, as I started to do my own research, I started to see that's not really the case. You're starting to see a lot of the same exploitation go on that we complained about in the past. We're seeing assaults, murders happen at the hand of the Chinese, usurping of government. Same thing like when I look at what happened to, although slightly different circumstances, what happened to people like Patrice Lumumba. I want to ask you, I want to kind of stay on this topic a little bit longer. What is your opinion on the preponderance of China in Africa? Because to me, it just looks like more exploitation, more neo-colonialism. I don't really see any benefits. Maybe there are, I just don't see any.
No, of course, because there aren't. I mean, in the final analysis, your point is unquestionably correct. And Nana John Henrik Clark told us this. Nana Kwame Ture told us this. Nana Amos Wilson told us this. Mama Marimba Ani tells us this. Everyone has warned us of the reality that Africa has no permanent friends. Let's be and I would even argue no friends, no real friends. Period. There's no one literally no one who has come into our home or come into the African continent for all relative purposes without having developed, excuse me, an agenda to be able to exploit and damage, unfortunately, the reality of our existence there. So, the Asian influx of this new part of the continuum of imperialism is no exception. I think it's really interesting because we consider these relationships in a very limited lens with very limited lenses. And I recall when I started to learn how the Chinese, in particular, started to really infiltrate certain areas within the continent and started developing these relationships where they were supplying weapons for really cheap. They were, moving for our relative purposes to help, and I say very loosely, build infrastructure in certain spaces, again, for very cheap. And we look at what that has developed into now. There's an assumption, if you will, of the right to be able to own and exploit the same way that Europeans came in and did when they called themselves bringing some sense of civilization when, they imposed their will, and they imposed their interests as far as what they wanted to see developed in particular countries on the continent. So we have to be really, really careful with these relationships, because I don't say that to be an extremist, and I don't say that to sound, just, arrogantly exaggerated. But the reality is that we need to go back to a point of understanding that, and at first and foremost, we need Ujima and we need Umoja amongst African people
Mm,
clearly before we start considering what our relationship is to the rest of the world. There's a context in which we struggle here in this country, and not just here, elsewhere as well, where folk believe or folk will say that, oh, we need to link with other people who are oppressed in this manner or that manner. And we recognize the history where at one point in time the Chinese were oppressed in the same way that African people and other people of different ethnicities and nationalities have been oppressed throughout the world by Europeans. But let's be really clear, what they did was, certainly not develop some sense of a revolutionary model through which they intended to contribute to that liberation, at those liberation efforts for others around the world. They organize themselves in a way to be able to continue the exploitation, and for themselves to at some point even be able to take the position or the role once held predominantly by Europeans. And this is what we see kind of happening in the global geopolitical, if you will, context. And we need to be very careful about that as African people. I think that these relationships, this is my personal opinion, I think all of these relationships need to be severed. People need to be put out. And we need to regroup, reorganize ourselves to the point where, again, we reach a level of empowerment that is sustainable, and then we can have conversations about negotiating what we want or don't want, in relationship to others um, on the planet. But there are no permanent friends to Africa. History has shown us that. Herstory and history has shown us that. And, unfortunately, we see it playing out, as I mentioned, today, now more than ever across the continent.
yeah, and just kind of like an end point, I want to move on to another topic, is that a lot of times I've had conversations with people. So people will talk about, like, what the Irish went through, the Italians, various other groups. But the problem is that the magnitude of what happened to African people that were dispersed throughout this diaspora is really no symmetry in that sort of conversation. If you look, because other
Right.
groups, you had the benefit to fit into the modality of whiteness. So even if you came over as an Irishman or Italian and you were oppressed in your country, you could come here and become a white man. And so you could juxtapose yourself against Black people and reap all of the benefits that were cultivated in the society off of the labor and toil of African people. And so whenever people are having these conversations about looking at all of these oppressed groups, it's kind of like we're supposed to have this agape love, but it's never reciprocated back. And like you
Right.
said, we have to have some semblance of unity and solidarity and in power before we can entertain those sorts of conversations, because it's just going to lead to perennial exploitation. On
Oh
this
yeah.
train of thought, this is something that I want to get your perspective on as an elder, as a scholar, as an activist. And this is something I've really seen amongst younger people. I don't know if you've encountered this, but it kind of worries me. Amongst a lot of
Mhm.
younger woke black folks that I've met, um, it's just kind of new. It's not even a new idea, but it's more so this concept of history to say, hey, black people here in the Western Hemisphere, we're aboriginals, we're indigenous, we're not Africans. And and I know, believe it or not, this is something I'm encountering a lot, and that's why I bring it up to get astute perspectives on it. I've met young people where they, and even certain rappers like Waka Flocka, I've came out and said, "Hey, I'm not African. Don't connect me to that. My people come from the Cherokee or the Blackfoot or the Chickahominy, or all these different groups that you could find, up and down the Eastern Seaboard or into New England." And it worries me because I have people that legitimately are trying to say that the transatlantic slave trade was fabricated and that the numbers are nowhere. These are black people saying this. The numbers are nowhere near as large as what we've been told. And what they're saying is that uh, people have came together to try to hide our history from us, that we're the real natives and that we're not African at all. And this whole movement seems to be catching a lot of momentum amongst young people. So my question is, have you encountered this sort of perspective? And if so, what is your opinion on this whole thing about us not being Africans and the disconnect from West Africa? Why do you think that's becoming so popular amongst younger people?
All right. Well, there's a couple things I want to cover with that. I think I've already answered the question in terms of what my opinion is on it because I made it clear that my identity is African. There's no conversation to have as far as I'm concerned in relationship to that. And yeah, I'm quite clearly aware of the nonsense, but there's always been nonsense. There's been nonsense before you and I were born, and before the scholars some of the ones that we've mentioned already, before they were born. There's always been nonsense and confusion in order to keep us separated from the continent of Africa. So we're not confused about that. We're really clear. Uh, Unfortunately, there's enough misinformation. It doesn't take a lot in terms of misinformation for folks to be able to take that, if you will, and run with it. And that's part of what we're seeing at the present time. The question would simply be, well, where did the Cherokee and the Blackfoot and the others come from? If you're calling yourself indigenous in that context, which I think is stupidity, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment.
Indeed,
Um,
indeed.
then you have to ask the question, of course, what were their cultural influences? And if you don't know enough to be able to to connect, excuse me, that history to where African people not only had influence in terms of shaping the cultures of the indigenous peoples within this hemisphere, the so-called Americas or misnamed Americas. At some point, we got to get away from all of that too. But if we don't have enough information to be able to make those connections, then yeah, we get caught up in those conversations and think that they're intelligent conversations, but they really are not. Um, I call it stupidity because there's a simple factor that, if we, for what all relative purposes, are have been misled in our identification, excuse me, with African people, and the falsification of our consciousness and identity
Mm.
is a fallacy, as a fallacy in and of itself. Then the question is simply, at what point do we have comparable historical documentation that the perspective that they're sharing is accurate? Why is it that we have thousands of years of scholars, quite literally, that we can point to with information that makes our transition from the continent to here quite clear, that tells that story in a very clear, very succinct manner. And that's regardless of where, again, we were dropped off in the world, whether it's here in the misnamed Americas, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the Caribbean, wherever we were dropped off in the world. We're very clear there are there are scholars, excuse me, and historians that have clear documented information about the origins of the people there. Where is that comparable information for those who claim, that our origin, so to speak, starts here? So we have to put that in some sort of a context that makes a bit more sense. Are there African, if you will, people who are likely indigenous to this land? Probably so, because the reality is we traveled the world. Like, let's make it, let's be real clear about this. We didn't, just pop up here and all of a sudden everything springs from here. But that does not change the reality of our ancestors' captivity, which is what contributed to the majority of our people who exist here now, existing here, and the populations that were developed. We weren't just here as a result of the small populace of Africans that we may be able to point to, excuse me,
Yeah.
who we could consider indigenous, if you will, to this space. And I don't even know if that's even an appropriate term, because as I mentioned, our population of the world came about as a result of travel. If we study Sheikh Anta Diop, we're really
Mm,
clear about what those migrations look like in a number of different ways. Certainly to get to the Americas, and even preceding that, the realities of the existence of Europeans in and of themselves. Um, Again, this is all information we can struggle with. We can, we can wrestle with it, so to speak, and we can dialogue over it. But make no mistakes about the historical record, be it written or oral, or in some other fashion, spiritual even, that we have, that points to our African identity. And we shouldn't be confused and get ourselves too riled up about some of these conversations where folk, for whatever reason or another, they want to believe the lie.
yeah, and I agree, especially if you're in a place like Richmond, considering the role of the dispersal of Africans out of Richmond being one of these centers after 1807. And there's so much history here that you can actually go and reference to disprove that. I guess what's troubling to me is how so many young folks that aren't equipped with the proper information, aren't equipped with the proper scholarship or the reputable scholars, and able to really be able to know truly how the masses of us really came over here to this particular land. And the fact that it's attractive to young people, that's kind of something that I kind of fight against. You know, a lot of times older people seem to be a little bit more open to real concrete information at times. And that's kind of been my experience. And my last issue with this particular argument is that I feel like it's a spit in the face to what we've gone through via slavery. Like, if you're trying to tell me that the transatlantic slave trade was overblown, if you're trying to tell me that we were already here, and to dismiss the evidence, the volumes of evidence to support the fact that this was a real event that happened to us, it's self-hate, it's disrespect to our ancestors, and it's something I can't tolerate. If you try to bring that up in my conversation, I have to smash that argument into pieces personally. But I want to move on to a different topic. When I was looking at your bio and a lot of the work that you've done, could you explain emotional emancipation healing circles? I've heard a little bit about that, but could you just definitely provide a little bit more definition, if you will?
Certainly, certainly, certainly. I do want to make a statement, man, if I can, again, because you left us with some things that I feel it's important to button up a little bit, if you will. Um, Again, I don't, I am in my lifetime, I guess I should say, I know my personality to be curt in some ways, where, as I indicated, there are just some conversations I'm not going to entertain. At one point in time, I felt like what you did, I had to go out and smash everybody's, lack of truth. I had to go out and destroy these arguments. And quite literally, I remember days that I would go, and there's no need to call out different groups' names, but, people would be along Broad Street or wherever people hung out, and we would get into these ideological battles, so to speak, which, were in hindsight, probably more mental masturbation than edification of some
Yeah.
sort. But the final analysis is I'm in a space now where I'm really clear that there's just some conversations I'm not going to engage in, and you can believe whatever you want to believe as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Lawrence Fishburne told the white boy in the Matrix, if you if you don't want to listen to what I'm saying, cool. You can wake up tomorrow. You can tell yourself whatever story you need to tell yourself. But in the final analysis, we still have the responsibility of working towards our people's liberation, and it is not going to come about with this confusion of a false identity and a false understanding of that connection to the history and the identity of
Mm.
peoples within this country. It is without question that Africa is our home, and it is without question that the success, excuse me, of our liberation will come in the total liberation and total unification of Africa and African people the world over. Um, so back to your latter question. Um, let's see. I gotta think of how I want to back up, if you will, with some of it. It you know, I think that one of the things that I feel like I feel like I'm learning or continuing to learn is that we also have to be in control of the discourse, that we're engaged, that surrounds us. Like, we have to really take an opportunity to evaluate those things that have become popularized, and for some to be able to discuss in terms of what is, or to project, excuse me, what is or isn't important about us. And so the reason why the EECs are important is because we don't have circles or spaces, or maybe that's too expansive to say, but there are not many spaces or circles within which African people can come together solely as African people and deal with the actual issues that we've never really been able to receive therapy for, that we've never really been able to receive any kind of recognition or understanding of, that will help clarify some of the mental illness, some of the disruptive behavior, some of the internal, not I'll say inject what Baba Wakesa Mazumoyo would call injected scripts of racism, white supremacy.
Mhm.
And so the EECs are designed, they were designed by these what do you call it, Association of Black Psychologists, to create these spaces for African people to come together, and with the sole interest of being able to deal with just that, our literally, quite literally, our emotional emancipation. They're not designed as study groups. They're not designed as circles that expand into some other social or political action. They're solely spaces where African people come together, and the model, if you will, is broken up into 7 keys, which I can't state all of the keys verbatim, uh, but ultimately what those key points, if you will, allude to are the fact that, as we've been talking, at least up to this point, we have to gain some sense of clarity about why it's important for us to change our thinking, and perhaps even clean the lenses through which we see our struggle, clean the lenses through which we see our existence, and what is necessary or what would be necessary in order for us to liberate ourselves, in order for us to change the conditions of African people in a mass context. And the circles, I can't pinpoint in my head right now when it started, but in terms of Richmond, I was a part of one of the well, not one, but the original cohort that was trained here in order to train, again, other folks in this process. And so, and we're still working on that in conjunction with some of the other things that I think that are important for us to address in terms of issue-oriented struggle.
Mhm.
But the EECs remain a platform, at least from my opinion, through which we can take the opportunity to talk with each other, talk about those things, those traumatic responses, the impact, if you will, excuse me, of those traumatic responses, the impact of the continued, um, there's a term that's used currently, urban trauma that we face, and how, for all other purposes, we develop the resilience and the resistance to be able to overcome those conditions.
Uh, Listening to you just now, it made me think about our powerful sister, Dr. Joy DeGruy, when she talks about the
The group,
post-traumatic slave syndrome. And to me, I
yeah,
want to ask you this. When we talk about the edification of our people, when we talk about upliftment, when we talk about liberation, we'll mention everything. We'll mention economics. We'll mention, studying the history. We'll mention conversations, dialogue that we can have as it relates to community activist groups. But when I look at, I came across her work a few years back, and when I look at her work, and she talks about the multi-generational psychological trauma that we've acquired, being in this particular under this particular paradigm, and we really had no real catharsis to release or be able to heal that psychological trauma. Let me ask you this: when you're talking about liberation and healing of African peoples, is addressing mental health part of that conversation? And if so, if it is, where does how do we go about solving, or not even solving, but really addressing the preponderance of mental health issues that we've acquired just living under this system? When you look at the systemic poverty, the mass incarceration, and all of the stressors that it produces on us, and then the fact too that we kind of have a negative connotation against going and seeking therapy or addressing our mental health issues. It feels like, to me, if you're talking about healing African people, you have to address the mental health aspect. Do you see that as part or one of the tools of liberation, addressing mental health in our community?
oh, without question. I mean, it's a part of what we need to heal and repair or fix in the context of us being whole people or returning to a whole state. Our empowerment certainly doesn't come about without it. And just for clarity, I got the sister's name is DeGru.
Drew, I
Dr. Joy
apologize.
DeGru. No, 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 no. It's not. That wasn't to correct you, but to inform others who will be listening, just so that
Oh yeah,
as
yeah.
they continue on in their study, they'll have the point
And
of
it
reference
informed me as well.
to return her work. Well, yeah, 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 yeah. But so yes, mental health is without question a part of it. I think that oftentimes we're really not clear about what it means in order to be able to strengthen our mental health. I'm also an instructor for what's called mental health first aid, which is I mean it's like most of these uh, interventions that we engage in. It has its white background, if you will. But the reality is that in the context of acknowledging and recognizing those things that need to be addressed for what's happening with us psychologically, it doesn't provide a framework. I mean, we don't have a framework, excuse me, that's been developed for that in the general context of our daily living. And so that's part of what I was referring to in terms of why the EECs were established. However, I feel like it's important for us to take that much further, because our mental health is a lot more, or I should say, um, repairing our mental health incorporates a lot more than just our understanding of the quote unquote um, DSM-5 or whatever the latest version of it is now, and all of the listed diseases, if you will, that happens. We have to take it from a context of what you even alluded to from the very beginning of this conversation, and that is understanding the damage, understanding what has happened to us as African people and what we've undergone to get to a point where it may seem like, for all relative purposes, we're adhering to these systemic inequities. We're adhering to these conditions of oppression. We're adhering to these things that we know keep us in a state of powerlessness and exploitation. But for whatever
Mhm.
reason or another, we act like, everything's good, or as we say, it's all good, in the hood. And that's just the reality that we really need to break through and break past. Um, when it comes to dealing with mental health from a perspective from I guess from my own vantage point, I look at what we undergo, particularly as African men, and this is again not this is not a conversation about who suffers the most, African men versus African women. There's unquestionably there's far more that we have to deal with in terms of the impact of oppression and the impact of the aftermath of the psychological damage that has happened to us with African women. That needs to be dealt with, but it also needs to be dealt with through and by African women, in the forefront of that exploration. And I would argue the same thing should happen with us as African men.
Yeah.
But when I just think about the reality of how we engage the world, the lens through which we engage the world, the confidence through which we engage the world, the discipline that we lack or establish in the
Yeah.
context of the things that we engage in, again, in relationship to the rest of society, and the way that we even have become disconnected and distrustful. Um, all of those things are remnants, if you will, of the needs for improvement in terms of our psychological health, the psychic health. But there's another element that I think that is important for us to introduce here. And we've got to understand that mental health or psychic health from a world context is grandly different than what it means for us as African people.
Mm.
Um, I'm becoming, I'm becoming and I'll explain what I mean by that, but I'm becoming, I think, a lot more of what people are utilizing this term Afro pessimist in these days as I think through, my Pan African ideological, grounding and background or foundation. And what I mean by that is that we've got to understand, as we were talking a little bit earlier, that our relationship to the rest of the world is very different. And I don't say that just to be, to I don't know, to create some sort of
Yeah.
energy in a way that's not warranted. The rest of the world's psychic health. We should study definitely Dr. Frank Wilderson's work. And there's a wealth of related scholars that he constantly references that I think that will help shape our understanding of this. But the rest of the world's psychic health depends, quite literally depends on our lack of being incorporated into the realm of humanity and a lack of our recognition
Mm.
as being human beings. In other words, these identities that we assume as people that keep us divided, fearful, and conquered. I mean, and yeah, divided, fearful, and ignorant. Excuse me, about who we are and in what ways we need to navigate the world.
Yeah.
It's important for the rest of the world to remain sane in order for us to see us in that form of fashion. Because the moment that we break that, it disrupts their ability, for all other purposes, to grasp a sense of value for how they then in turn see themselves. And so that spills over into the conversation we were having earlier, where we were talking about quote unquote friends of African people. Even if we choose to get in solidarity with other groups, we can't be naive enough to believe that at the point that we reach some sort of measured empowerment, that these other groups won't take the opportunity to turn, as history has already shown us, against us in that moment. And so we have to be prepared for those things and really just understand and be clear that we're not moving through life through the history that we're creating right now with the game or the end goal of creating this hand holding kumbaya you know um,
Hmm.
reality in terms of a utopian existence. No, for me, I'm always African interest first.
Mm.
African centered in absolutely everything that I do, in the way that I approach the world. And if I don't do that, or if I can't do that, then I think that I paint myself into a critical corner from which it'll be almost impossible to get ourselves out of, if we're seriously talking about changing the conditions that have devastated us for so many uh, generations.
Yeah, that is a really interesting perspective because from what I extrapolated from what you just said, it's almost as the mental health of all other non-African peoples is almost this kind of diametrically opposed situation where we have to be in a state of without or lacking for their state to be sufficient. And kind of like
Yeah.
it's almost like a parasitic relationship. That's kind of how I interpreted it just now. But I want to ask you something back to the initial point. Um, and this is my own experience, and I'm gonna speak personally for myself and other brothers that I know. There seems to be a lot of trepidation
Brother, I
amongst
must
Black men.
apologize. I gotta pause you real quick, brother, because you broke out on me, so I'm
Okay.
not hearing
Am
the
I back?
fullness of what your question is.
Am I back?
You froze up on me for a quick minute, so
Okay,
I don't know
okay.
if I
I didn't
heard
even get
all
deep
of
into
what
the
you
question. Let me go ahead and repeat it.
said
All right. Am I back? Am
a
I
few minutes
good?
ago. Yes, I can
Okay.
hear you clearly.
Essentially, there seems to be a lot of trepidation amongst Black men to admit that they need help as far as like getting therapy, mental health. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm
Okay.
the same way. And even I remember growing up, you would hear a lot of brothers and sisters say, "Oh, that's white people stuff to go seek a therapist." We know how to man it up and suck it up and handle it on our own. And I want to ask you, where do you think that comes from? Where it almost seems as if there's shame to saying, "Hey, I might need to go and see a therapist," or "I'm having mental health issues." Why do you think that's so preponderant
Yep.
amongst us, especially amongst Black men, when I have these conversations?
I mean, man, so we have to look at all of the ills that we face and many of the contradictions within ourselves in the context of how we are impacted by, racism and assumed white supremacy. We've got to be real clear about what role that actually played in developing our psyches to the point where we see taking care of our mental health, if you will, as a detriment as opposed to something that's needed. So, this is a circumstance that certainly is no exception, particularly for men of African descent. And I want to pause this for a second because you froze up on me again. Are
Yeah,
you
you
hearing me
just froze up
clearly
on
all the
me.
way through?
Okay, you're good. You're good. Can you see me? Am I still freezing up?
Okay, cool, cool.
Okay. Okay.
No, 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 no. You seem to be fine. I just didn't know if that meant that you weren't hearing me either. So I'll go back just a little bit. Um,
Well, no, I could
so to
still
the
hear
point,
you. You just
again.
froze up the picture, but I could hear everything you were saying.
Oh, okay. Well, great,
Yeah.
great, 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 great.
Yeah.
So then, in the context of this, like I said, this is absolutely no exception. When we deal with the circumstance and I would say that it's not unique to brothers, but certainly where brothers uh, um, maybe not fearful, but definitely reticent to seek mental health, if you will, support in whatever way, shape, or form that shows itself. uh, We have to go back and think about the condition and the reality of well, what happened in terms of the deconstruction and the breakdown of our psychological indigenous psyches to begin with, at one point in time, to even the suggested issue for us to want to escape our circumstances of captivity. That it was quite literally a law on the books that suggested that if a person was trying to run away from the plantation, that they then in turn were absolutely, were in some sense insane.
Oh,
That this was
trichotillomania.
a mental health issue. Right, 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 right.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm glad you brought the word up because I was leading to that. But like I said, I want to try to keep things clear and as concise or simple as possible for some to be able to follow up on. But yeah, drapetomania was quote unquote a recognized mental health condition. And so just think about the ridiculousness of that. Think about the nonsense in relationship to that. There's no real science whatsoever involved. There's no real psychological, analytical, anything, attributed to that. It was just merely confusion and nonsense that was put out by those who the controlling interests, those who were in power, in order to continue to try to maintain control of our thinking and our ability, if you will, to break through those barriers in terms of the optimal psychic health. So you fast forward, to a current context where if we showed any type of emotional pain, or we showed any type of yeah, I'll just leave it at that, emotional pain in
Mhm.
relationship to how we were encountering these conditions of the captivity of our ancestors at the time. As I'm pretty sure many of the rest of us do, we were beaten and we suffered like horrible consequences, throughout. Some people had parts of their brains that were taken out. Some people had, these fake lobotomies. People were beaten, uh, castrated, all other kinds of things that have, again, no real connection to any real science, no real connection to
Mhm.
anything that had anything to do with trying to improve the condition of the person. It was really just a lot of horrible consequences, unfortunately, that were maintained in order to be able to keep us broken, if you will, as a people. You fast forward that, as I mentioned, excuse me, to the current context. Um, the, there's reticence resides in our DNA. It resides there because we understand it's kind of multifold. I don't want to suggest that this is the only reason for it,
Mhm.
but it resides in our DNA. Where one, we're looking to avoid the pain and that comes with the consequences of expressing, that emotional discord, or it furthers to a point where we have these fake identities around what masculinity is and what it means in order to be engaged in the practice, if you will, of being a man.
Yeah.
All of this comes from the same pseudo white dominant patriarchal modes of thinking that we've been conditioned with. And so
Mhm.
there's different layers as to why that is at a present context, but we also, like I said, we've always got to take it back to the source of our destruction again, at least in a historical level. Not obviously, we're not destroyed as a people because we are here. We're resilient. We've been resilient, and we've survived. But we've got to take everything back to that source and then kind of deconstruct it, if you will, from there, in order to be able to understand what we're going through right now. And the largest part of that, if you will, if I can add one more thing, is the fact that we have been so heavily culturally misoriented, as Nana Kobe Kambon, taught us, that cultural misorientation helped further the thinking that, for all other purposes, it's against our interest to be concerned, or to prioritize our psychic or our mental health, in the context of all of these things that we pursue, whether we're pursuing liberation or whether we're pursuing, getting the bag, if you will, in order to be able to survive. It all, comes back around to the fact that we've been, as people used to say, brainwashed and
Yeah.
conditioned into these modes and responses, if you will, to the world around us.
And moving on, I want to talk a little bit about your activism as it relates to mass incarceration. I know from my research that I think in 2016 you were working with the New Virginia Majority, and you guys were working to restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated peoples. And what I want to ask, this is kind of a comparison, a crude comparison that I've had. I liken the slave trade's impact on Africa to over centuries, rather, because we're talking about centuries here, to the crack cocaine epidemic's impact on the Black family unit to a degree. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at the amount of people that were taken out of Africa, it had horrible effects on those societies and the people that were still there, that you can still see till this day. And what I want to ask you, when you look at, for one, definitely please talk about your work with the New Virginia Majority as it relates to mass incarceration and restoring voter rights, please. But also, what are some of the impacts of mass incarceration on the Black community that we may not be cognizant of, and we may not be actually talking about? What are some of those impacts that you see on a day-to-day basis with your work?
Okay. So I just want to, I think it's important for me to separate and clarify. I will not give New Virginia Majority the privilege of associating any of my work with what I was doing at the
Ooh,
time when I was
okay.
employed with them. I need to put that out there. I won't. We have such a very distinct difference in terms of my reason for stopping my work with them was because we have very distinct differences in terms of understanding what it took and what was important with regard to organizing our people, which I had been doing already for decades before I even knew that they existed. And so I felt that it was, important for, as I mentioned to you earlier, there's some conversations I'm just not going to have. And
Yeah.
I don't really, care to get into any more detail than that. So, however, the work that I was doing in terms of what we, at least that under the guise of ending mass incarceration and I would argue reforms in relationship to the criminal legal system was happening before I came in contact with that organization. Yet, nonetheless, the work that I was doing in particular was really was really me being strategic in attempting to find ways to be able to move the needle, or as we used to say, Kwame Ture, that is, to push people further and further to the left, as far to the left as possible on certain issues, and which was to set the seed or sow the seeds for community members who then become politically educated, who then become organized in a way to be able to develop the agendas that we need um, to liberate ourselves and to change the conditions within our communities and to empower our communities and to improve or enhance the opportunities, excuse me, within those communities. It was really, it's always been a strategy centered around that. So I want to just kind of put that out there first and foremost, that, my engagement in many of these reform efforts has really only been a matter of strategy in terms of sowing seeds to push us further and further towards a revolutionary objective, whether they work or whether they don't work, and we realize that we need to move to another level in terms of our strategies to then in turn affect our conditions. But with that said, in terms of your question, in terms of with regard to things with regard to mass incarceration in particular and its impact in the current context, I think that the challenge is that folk don't recognize that on the one hand, these conditions that we have identify, where we identify people as criminals, where we call certain behavior and certain activities criminal, where we've even developed a means of defining crime, right? We do this in a manner that we are often unaware of how those conditions for what the impetus for those behaviors or so-called crimes are in the first place. And what I mean by that is, some people kind of misinterpret this, and it will require far more than what I think we could do to break it down to a just level of full understanding. But people make a very loose association with the existence of poverty and crime, as if poverty in and of itself is a root cause, which, in some conversations you can have, perhaps that's a true statement. But the reality is it's much deeper than just the existence of poverty. It's the reality that there is a disconnect in terms of what the family structure and, for all relative purposes, what the community structure looks like. And with the absence, with the massive absence of African people, started out with African men, which is now, the rates of African women, have also uh, 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 gone much higher over the years, over the decades, uh, in terms of their incarceration, and then the age, the younger our people are becoming incarcerated and pulled
Mm.
into this wicked system. We have to take into consideration that this massive removal of African men, of African women, of African youth from our communities not only furthers the breakdown and the disruption of the African family and for all relative purposes, African people as a whole, but it speaks very specifically to the to support, I'm sorry, excuse me, the racist and ridiculous policies that
Mm.
have been put in place in order to keep our people in particular, suppressed in a particular way. So if you don't create these conditions of quote unquote mass incarceration, then, slick tongued Joe Biden can't come back to us, whatever this is, 20 odd years later, and
Mhm.
sell or suggest that for whatever reason or another, he's going to be the savior of removing these racist policies and racist conditions that African people find themselves under when it comes to conditions of being arrested, conditions of being incarcerated, and the collateral consequences of that incarceration, or just that being pulled into the criminal legal system in and of itself. When at one point in time he championed these policies, and I'm not inclined to believe that he still doesn't. That's just my personal opinion. Well, it's more than my personal opinion. I've got information and political continuity, if you will, of
Yeah.
action to back it up. But ultimately, the point is, so when you remove, a people in mass, it makes it easier to maintain the conditions of control in certain aspects, and then you control the conditions in terms of which they live, which, as I mentioned a little earlier, you can go into someone's home, and take control. You can mistreat and disrespect them wherever you see them, and so we've already gone into the home and removed African men, or to the degree that we've developed just a sense of doing so for African women. And now we're creating these conditions, excuse me, exist where African families are existing in a mode of survival that only plays into the hands of the conditions that create an environment for which we have to make decisions that they have deemed or defined as criminal.
Yeah.
It even defines the kind of crime that a person can so-called be engaged in. And this is also something that Nana Amos Wilson taught us, for example, where, we talk about young African men, in the streets, if you will, busting somebody upside the head, trying, to get money or whatever the case is. Well, yeah, if you taught that, if they were all taught to be accountants, then it would change the level and the condition of the type of crime in which a person could, be engaged in. But you've
Sure.
kind of created a circumstance where if that is the aim and the objective, which is everybody's quote unquote objective under the so-called American white way, everybody wants to have their house, their white one with the picket fence and all that other crap. Well, you've created a specific set of social conditions under which you've already told me that I am worthless and that I am not valued as a human being. You've also, on top of that, you've limited the opportunities for me to be able to advance myself in any kind of a way beyond the structure of identifying myself or being potentially recognized, because we're still not really fully recognized, but potentially recognized as a human being. And you've taken away the ability to be able to utilize the so-called education as a means to resolve the issues that are occurring, with my people and within our communities. And so you compound all of those things, the sister or the brother on the street who wants no more than any other person in society wants, in terms of being able to see themselves at a level of comfort, if you will, and sustenance, that they don't have to struggle. in the ways that unfortunately that we have to that we find ourselves having to do. And so, again, if these same young sisters and brothers were accountants, then you would change the type of quote unquote crime that they'd be engaged in. Then they would, they could, quote unquote, as Dr. I mean, not Amos Wilson said, we could rob people by books instead of, busting them upside the head. And so all of these things are factors in terms of understanding why it was important for those in power within these systems to incarcerate us in mass, to really be able to remove us physically, remove our bodies physically from one circumstance and into the next. I could go on because there's so many other layers that I think that are important, but ultimately, I think that what's key, if nothing else, is folk need to understand that in order to reverse this, we got to do far more than just legislate ourselves out of it. If we don't create the conditions by which we start to figure out ways to resolve issues between us on our own that can circumvent the so-called criminal legal system, we don't come up with ways to be able to deal with the issues and the conflicts that arise within our communities, then we'll keep seeing ourselves subject to having to adhere to the the path, if you will, that's created by this carceral system.
For the people that's going to listen to this, do you have any good if they wanted to kind of expand their knowledge about mass incarceration? Do you have any good readings or scholars that they should look into?
Man, okay, so here's where there'll be a small contradiction for me because there will, yes, is the answer to that. I mean, there's a million books. Like, there's a book about pretty much everything that you really want to know anything about. But there are actually some um, European writers who I will include in this because I think that the way that they deconstruct some of the things that are important to understand when it comes to the impact of mass incarceration on African people, it becomes critical to see it from the lens of the those who are classified, if you will, in the group of the dominant, quote unquote, assumed dominant group, as well as understanding even more clearly what that should mean for us in terms of our interpretation, if you will, of the lens for which for the why, the how, and the root causes of the systemic realities. And so of course, if nothing else, I think everybody should read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which, it's a pretty straightforward, pretty, I don't want to say simplistic, but it's a pretty straightforward analysis of what I only alluded to in this conversation, taking us from the point of if you will, enslavement of African people, the connections between the development of the structures of this criminal legal system from the police itself and the existing legal structures into, a modern context where we're looking at the reality that African people, and other ethnicities and nationalities that don't classify themselves as white now make up the majority of people across the country who are incarcerated. Where this country, in and of itself, of course, incarcerates over 2.5 million, or nearly 3 million at this point. Which is significantly larger than any other country, like quite literally in the world.
Mhm.
Um, she breaks all of that stuff down in a way that I think is easy to understand. I actually think, while it may not seem to be an immediate match, that the book that you alluded to earlier, Dr. Joy DeGrew's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, becomes important because in order to understand why, uh, for all relative purposes, the persons in power who have created these conditions of being able to extract our young men and our young women from our communities, we have to understand what it is that happens with us psychologically, not in a both a real-time context and post context in terms of the collateral consequences of what being incarcerated ends up doing for us in a physical way that in turn impacts our psyche and psyches and mentality, from having come out of the condition of enslavement and its I'll say current day existence
Mhm.
incarceration, if that makes any sense.
Indeed.
So I would make sure I would make sure that that book is included. There's another book called by this is one of the European writers that I was referring to, Daniel Serid, uh, entitled "Until We Reckon." Won't go into a whole detailed analysis of it, but ultimately, what she does there is create the space for Europeans to not only understand the impact and consequences, if you will, of the current model for quote unquote pursuing public safety and justice and how it doesn't work, but she also creates gives you guidance, if you will, in terms of models for which the early what I alluded to earlier in terms of our communities figuring out, well, what do we want to do in terms of dealing with these conflicts, or what do we want to do in terms of the pursuit of justice, from meeting our own interests and putting our own interests first. She lays out some things that I think are really valuable models, to consider in relationship to that. Um, uh, there's another book that I cannot think of the author of at the moment, but the book is entitled "A Plague of Prisons." And what that book does, I think, effectively is it makes the case that mass incarceration, if you will, is a public health crisis, which with which I don't unquestionably agree. I mean, and it breaks down an analysis, if you will, of how to deconstruct what we see in terms of the conditions that lead to mass incarceration. Of course, everything from what people are accustomed to referring to in terms of the cradle to prison pipeline, all the way through to the quote unquote drug wars that have plagued our people since the 70s, and I would argue at different points in history, but nonetheless, how those things deconstructs those things, excuse me, in a manner to understand them from a public health lens, and how we can then apply theories and practices from a public health standpoint to be able to, in turn, change the conditions, if you will, that allow those systemic realities to maintain a stranglehold, if you will, on our people. And so those are four that come to mind in an immediate context. I'd be happy to send you a larger list, a much longer list, if needed, that you want to share with readers in some
Definitely.
form of fashion, and I can give you a little bit more detail about them in the context of writing that down and doing it as well.
Definitely. Well, look, definitely we're going to wrap up here. And I want to thank you for one, elucidating a lot of these concepts about the systemic injustices, talking about our history, talking about how certain things like an African identity looks in a modern context. I think these are invaluable lessons and information that's definitely, it helped me so far in this podcast. And it's going to help enlighten and put things into perspective for the people that listen to this. How can people follow you if they're interested in kind of keeping up with the work that you're doing? How can they find you on social media?
Well, if you're trying to follow me, you're not going to do it on social media. If you're trying to follow me, I need to see you out in the street. I need to see you in our people's communities. I need to see you in organizations that are working to alleviate our people's suffering. That's the way to follow me. If you're trying to do it on social media, you're going to get, a bunch of pictures and maybe some words that might be of value here or there, but it won't lead you to following much of anything in all sincerity, because I intentionally don't maintain that type of presence. Um, I
Well, I mean, I'm
have
saying if I'm in Oregon
activities.
and I listen to this podcast, I'm like, this brother said a lot of heavy stuff. Um, does he have like YouTube or any information that I can, if I'm not in the immediate area?
No, no, no. I understand. I understood. I understood. From the beginning. I guess that's just for me. That's just important to point out. The only thing that I have in terms of a social media presence is a fake Facebook page, And if a person is genuinely interested in getting in contact with me, you can certainly reach out to me, there. As far as asking any questions, I can also give an email address through which to reach me, which is simply my name. It's Iman Shabazz at yahoo.com. You can reach me there with any kinds of questions based on what you've heard in this podcast, and I'd be happy to respond, and we can establish, whether we need to talk via telephone or some other means from there. But I am redeveloping my website currently for maximum impact. The information unfortunately, on the maximum impact website is outdated, and so it won't give you a whole lot in terms of being able to connect with me. But if you're interested in just being able to see a glimpse, if you will, or a list of some of the things that we offer through the organization, you'll certainly be able to see that. And I ask that if again, to disregard the contact information there, but to reach me either through the email that I just gave. Again, Iman Shabazz, that's IMAN SHABAZZ at yahoo.com. Or if you absolutely need to reach me by phone, I can be reached at 804-394-5601. And leave a message for me there, and I'll reconnect with someone as well. But I will be updating. I will have the updated site, up and running, hopefully by the beginning of April. I think I'm on track to have those things in place by that point, and folks can get further information, so to speak, in that regard. But outside of that, you got to catch me in the street.
There you go. Listen, brother, once again, it's a deep honor to have you on. I'm glad that you decided to take time out of your schedule to converse with me today. This is going to be a lot of powerful information for people, a lot of empowering information as well. So I deeply, deeply thank you. And this has been a privilege, and I enjoyed it. And, I hope that everybody, shares this when they see this on Wednesday. Comment. The brother gave you his contact information. If you want to work with him, you want to meet up or what have you, it's definitely needed. And this brother is definitely a paragon of wisdom here in the Richmond area, a person that I consider a legend as well. So I definitely thank you. And this has been episode 58 of No Truths Barred. And make sure you're following me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. The YouTube channel is up as well. So make sure you follow me on all of those. And once again, much love. Take care and peace.